Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Toronto's Hiroshima Nagasaki Day Coalition, I welcome you to the commemoration of the 76th anniversary of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Our event is titled Hope for the Earth. Canada, sign the ban treaty. My name is Rosemary Keenan. I'm the co-chair of the HNDC, along with Dr. Vinay Jindal, and I am pleased to be your host for this evening. Once again, the HNDC is pleased to offer this commemoration online. HNDC members worked with dedication, resourcefulness, and hope throughout the past year to bring the message of nuclear disarmament to all Canadians and to prepare this evening's webinar. Without government or corporate sponsorship, we relied on our donors. As a community group, we do not give charitable tax receipts. That means every dollar that is donated is hard-earned money. Every dollar carries with it a belief in our efforts, a hope for a nuclear weapons-free future, and every dollar is valued and appreciated. I would like to thank all our member organizations, Science for Peace, International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, Canada, Canadian Peace Congress, Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, Pax Christi Toronto, Japanese Canadian Cultural Centre, Toronto Buddhist Church, Toronto Article 9, and Toronto Area Interfaith Council. I would also like to thank our sponsors and supporters, Canadian Pugwash Group, Conscience Canada, Ontario Clean Air Alliance, National Association of Japanese Canadians, Greater Toronto NAJC, Peace Quest, and Project Save the World. Thank you as well to all the individuals who donate what they can to ensure that Toronto has a commemoration every year. A big thank you to Rachel Small and her staff at World Beyond War for their technical expertise in hosting this webinar. And a special thank you to our presenters who have put much time and thought into the music, reflections, and messages they bring this evening. The Hiroshima Nagasaki Day Coalition is an opportunity for local peace and community groups to come together, to share ideas and give a grassroots voice to Toronto's peace community, a voice among all the wonderful voices that strive to make Toronto a better place, to make the world a better place. Following the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists created the Doomsday Clock. The Doomsday Clock has become a universally recognized indicator of the world's vulnerability to catastrophe from nuclear weapons, from climate change, and from disruptive technologies. Nuclear nations have ignored or undermined practical and available diplomatic and security tools for managing nuclear risks. The potential for the world to stumble into nuclear war increased in 2020. On January 27th, 2021, the Doomsday Clock was set at 100 seconds to midnight, the closest it has ever been to the risk of nuclear destruction. As we reflect on the horrors of the atomic bombings and the devastation of nuclear weapons testing, we are faced with the reality that we are living in the most dangerous of times, but they are also the most hopeful of times. As the world is inching ever closer toward the abolition of nuclear weapons, we look to Canada for leadership. Today, on behalf of the Hiroshima Nagasaki Day Coalition, I welcome you to Hope for the Earth. Canada, sign the ban treaty. I would now like to invite Dr. Barbara Burkett to read the land acknowledgement.
Thank you. In Toronto, as we remember the horrific events of 1945, we acknowledge that we meet on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. This land is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaties signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. May we learn from the wisdom of these communities the ways of respect for our earth and its peoples. And it's now my pleasure to introduce, to help set the tone of this commemoration. We have back with us Toronto's Japanese-Canadian musician, Ron Korb. He has represented Canada at Expo in Japan and the Shanghai International Arts Festival, along with the Royal Winnipeg Ballet and the Montreal Symphony. Ron's sold-out concert at Shanghai Concert Hall was voted the audience choice by the fans. He plays flutes from China, Japan, Indonesia, Cambodia, Ireland, Norway, and has performed in concert halls and festivals across 5 continents. He's played on dozens of major motion picture soundtracks, including The 800, which was the highest grossing film of 2020. Ron has over 20 critically acclaimed releases in 20 countries and was nominated for a Grammy for his album, Asia Beauty. Welcome, Ron Korb. As we do each year, we look forward to the inspiration of your flute music.
Well, thank you very much. That was a great introduction. And it's always so wonderful to be here and to participate in this event. And we do, of course, miss being at Nathan Phillips, but this is the second year we've done it virtually, and it's kind of nice doing it as well. It has a different dimension to it. So I like the fact that we can, share this with the whole world. I was wondering what to play in this interval, and I thought I might play a few little things. This instrument here is from China, and it's called a bamboo shun. Just wanted to play a little bit on that to sort of, as my business partner used to say, clear the environment. Anyway, this is a lovely instrument from China. I'd like to play a little excerpt from this too. This is a little flute from Europe. Just to give you a taste of that as well. And, but mainly I thought it'd be nice to actually play the gold flute. And I don't think I've ever brought this to Nathan Phillips Square, actually. So here's a chance to play it. And this is a piece I wrote a few years ago. It's called a muse, and as you might think, it has a little bit of a comical side to it. And it uses some interesting techniques on the flute where you can play more than one note at a time. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ron, for sharing your wonderful musical talent with us this evening. I would now like to I have the privilege of introducing Bishop Rusilla Shaw. Bishop Rusilla Shaw became an Anglican priest in 2001 after studying at Wycliffe College in Toronto. She served as a youth minister and then as a parish priest in several churches and was ordained Bishop of Trent Durham in 2017. Bishop Shaw is Métis and serves as an ambassador of reconciliation in the Diocese of Toronto. I would like to invite Bishop Shaw to lead us in prayer. Bishop Shaw, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a privilege to be here this night. Today, we gather with hope for the earth in our hearts and in the front of our minds. We give thanks for many things and we pray for many things. Creator, thank you for this day you have given us. Thank you for calling us to gather here today. We ask you to enter where we are so that your teachings will work in us. Thank you for the desire you give us to respond with nonviolence, to work for a future with a hope. Thank you for gifting us with conscience, with community for support, with commitment and perseverance. Thank you also for rage, for righteous anger, that we might tap into it to change the world. We ask for a conversion of hearts, that people will come to see the preciousness of life on this fragile earth, our island home. We ask your continued blessing, especially upon Hibakushas, the people, and dare I say also the plants and creatures, all affected by nuclear war and its devastating effects. Give us strength and courage for all the people connected across and around the world to the tragedy that must not ever happen again in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In the words of Setsuko Thurlow, don't give up, keep pushing, see the light, crawl towards it. Our light now is the ban treaty. As she said, tonight let us follow each other out of the dark night of nuclear terror. No matter what obstacles we face, we will keep moving and keep pushing and keep sharing this light with others. This is our passion and commitment for our one precious world to survive. From Setsuko. A call to worship for the weary and the wary. Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who are struggling hard and carrying heavy loads." In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 11. So we come with all our weariness and wariness, our weariness with injustice, our weariness with fake news, our weariness with a world that seems determined to be hostile rather than welcoming, our weariness of what it might mean to truly live out our call, our wariness of how vulnerable our desire for openness might make us, our wariness of how safe it is to trust, where trust has so often been misplaced. Come and find not just rest for your souls, but channels for your rage. I share with you now a prayer with the 7 grandfather teachings from the people of the land here on Turtle Island, the indigenous name for this continent. Gracious and Holy One of blessing, we ask for wisdom so that we will know what is good in this world. We ask for love so we can spread your love everywhere. We ask for respect so that we will know that everyone comes from one place, from you. We ask for bravery so that we will not be afraid to do your work here. We ask for honesty so that no one will lie or harm any one of us. We ask for humility so that no one will be superior to another. And Lord of life and blessing, we ask for truth so that we will see you in the future on the last day with clean hearts and spirits. Amen.
Thank you, Bishop Shaw. We will now hear a message from Mayor John Tory, the Toronto City Council proclamation.
Hello, Mayor John Tory here. Today, August 6th, marks the 76th anniversary of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On this day, we honor those who lost their lives in the bombings, and we remember the utter devastation caused by the atomic bombs. We also acknowledge the necessity of finding nonviolent solutions for world issues and support the abolition and prohibition of nuclear weapons. This year's virtual ceremony, themed Hope for the Earth, Canada signed the ban treaty, will highlight the importance of having Canada join the many nations that have signed the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, in the hopes of working towards the elimination of nuclear weapons. Toronto City Council has unanimously called upon the Canadian government to support the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which would help create a safer, nuclear weapons-free world. The city is committed to working with others to make the world a safer and better place for everyone, while recognizing that work still needs to be done to achieve peace and security for all. With that, on behalf of Toronto City Council, I do hereby proclaim August 6th, 2021 as Hiroshima and Nagasaki Day in the City of Toronto. Thank you.
Please unmute Rosemary so we can hear you.
Sorry. We do applaud the leadership of Mayor John Tory and the Toronto City Council for their formal request that our Canadian government sign the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I would like to introduce 2 people now. I would like to, first of all, introduce, in a moment, we will meet Louis Lahelek. Louis is a high school student at University of Toronto Schools. Since his childhood, Lewis knew through his parents of the nuclear bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He was in fourth grade when he was introduced to the book Sadako and the Thousand Paper Cranes, written by Canadian-born author Eleanor Coor. When Lewis learned of the horrific impact of the nuclear bombing on Sadako's life, he was inspired to learn more, studying, reading, writing, speaking on the subject, and visiting both Hiroshima and Pearl Harbor to gain an understanding of all that occurred. You will hear Lewis read greetings from the mayor of Hiroshima, Kazumi Matsui, and the mayor of Nagasaki, Tomohisa Taue. This will be followed by a moment of silence in commemoration of the immense suffering and loss of life that occurred in these two cities. But before Lewis speaks with us, I would like to introduce Setsuko Thurlow. For many, Setsuko needs no introduction. She was a high school student of 13 when the bomb hit her beloved city of Hiroshima. Setsuko's life journey is dedicated to ridding the world of the threat of nuclear annihilation, which we all face. In 2017, Setsuko Thurlow, along with Beatrice Fine, received the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. Setsuko will provide introductory remarks for the video and slide presentation of the entry into force of the treaty in January of this year, including the New York celebration, the youth-led celebration in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the worldwide celebration of the entry into force of the treaty. Now I invite Lewis to speak, followed by a moment of silent reflection and commemoration. Then we will hear from Setsuko.
The Hiroshima and Nagasaki Peace Declaration of 2021. From Kazumi Matsui, mayor of the city of Hiroshima. On this day, 76 years ago, a single atomic bomb instantly reduced our hometown to a scorched plain. That bombing brought cruel death to countless innocent victims and left those who managed to survive with profound, lifelong physical and emotional injuries due to radiation, fear of after effects, and economic hardships. One survivor, who gave birth to a girl soon after the bombing, says, "As more horrors of the bomb came to light, and I became more concerned about their effect, I worried less about myself and more about my child. Imagining the future awaiting my daughter, my suffering grew, night after sleepless night. No one else should ever suffer as we have." These words express the will of survivors who, having known horrors too painful to recall, were condemned to fear, frustration, and agony by the likely future of their children and their own irradiated bodies. When hibakusha tell their stories, they convey not only the horror and the inhumanity of nuclear weapons, but also an intense yearning for peace, born of compassion. From the Tomohisa Taue, mayor of the city of Nagasaki. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT, promised that there would be no increase in nuclear weapon states, and that nuclear disarmament negotiations would be pursued in good faith. However, in the past few years, motions by nuclear weapon states to go back on the promise of nuclear disarmament have been increasing, as evidenced by initiatives such as the scrapping of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, or INF Treaty. In addition to that, the development and deployment of newer, more sophisticated nuclear weapons and smaller, easier to use nuclear weapons is proceeding. As a result, the threat of nuclear weapons being used is increasingly becoming real. 4 years ago, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or TPNW, was adopted by the United Nations. This treaty clearly states that nuclear weapons should be eliminated in accordance with the wishes of humanity. Among the nuclear weapons states and countries under the nuclear umbrella, there have been voices stating that it is too early for such a treaty. That is not so. Rather, nuclear arms reductions are far too late in coming. Next, an appeal from the mayor of Hiroshima to world leaders. This year, on January 22nd, the TPNW entered into effect. It remains now for world leaders to support this treaty, shifting their focus towards a truly sustainable society free from nuclear weapons. Our leaders and experience has taught humanity that threatening others for self-defense benefits no one. Our leaders must understand that threatening rivals with nuclear weapons achieves nothing of value, but treating each other with empathy and building long-lasting friendships connects directly to national self-interest. To that end, I urge all world leaders to visit Hiroshima and Nagasaki, achieve a deeper understanding of the bombings, fulfill the disarmament mandate of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and join the discussions aimed at maximizing the effectiveness of the TPNW. An appeal from the mayor of Nagasaki to the young people of the world. The novel coronavirus disease, global warming, and the problem of nuclear weapons share one thing in common, and that is that they affect all of us who live on this earth. Are nuclear weapons necessary for the world of the future that you will live in? Let us clear a path to a world free of nuclear weapons and walk down it together. And in closing, from the mayor of Hiroshima, the road to abolition will not be smooth, but a ray of hope shines from the young people now taking up the Hibakusha's quest. One survivor who witnessed hell that day entrusts our future to the young with these words. Start small, but start. I hope each of you will do whatever you can to promote and maintain the treasure we call peace. I ask our young to sustain an unshakable conviction that nuclear weapons are incompatible with full, healthy lives for their loved ones. I further ask them to share that conviction persuasively with people around the world. At this peace memorial ceremony, marking 76 years since the bombing, we offer heartfelt prayers for the peaceful repose of the souls of the atomic bomb victims. Together, with Nagasaki and like-minded people around the world, we pledge to do everything in our power to abolish nuclear weapons and light the way towards lasting world peace. Thank you. And now, please join us in a minute of silence.
Today, August 6th, the anniversary of Hiroshima, should be a day of somber reflection, not only on the catastrophic devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but also on what they signify, that they introduced the dawn of nuclear age, that humanity has been threatened by its potential annihilation for 76 years as hostage of 9 nuclear weapon armed states. And that threat is intensifying. Almost 50 years ago, here in Toronto, we started this commemoration with the support of the mayors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Mayor Crombie of Toronto. It has been a source of inspiration and support to hibakusha, the survivors, and activists to contemplate together on a meaningful response to the challenge of the nuclear age. Today, we are together with a growing number of people around the world to remember and honor those who perished in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and all those who have been victimized by uranium mining and by over 2,000 nuclear weapon testing worldwide. We are here also to renew and to redouble our commitment to work for the total abolition of nuclear weapons. Tonight, we are pleased to present for your viewing some videos and slides of active campaigners of ICAN, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, who celebrated the entry into force of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons on January 22nd this year. Our keynote speaker tonight, Erin Hunt, will be speaking on this exciting topic. This was a historic, groundbreaking achievement by some progressive non-nuclear weapon states, along with more than 600 like-minded citizens groups around the world. This success was so empowering to the world community. This slideshow provides a perspective on the range and diversity of the global celebration of the entry into force of the TPNW, including the creative action of illuminating the United Nations building with messages such as nuclear weapons always immoral, now illegal, and visiting 50 United Nations missions which ratified the treaty to thank them, present them with roses, and holding a polar bear swim, thus combining their sense of fun with their activism. As these images demonstrate, we are not alone. We are part of a larger global movement. First, we'll show you video, and slideshow will be shown at the end of this webinar be followed by lantern ceremony.
Each year in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, paper lanterns are made to represent the spirits of the people who perished in 1945, many of whom sought refuge in water from cities on fire. A 5-megaton bomb would devastate New York City and kill 7.9 million people. Those millions would be our children, our friends, our lovers. Nuclear weapons threaten everyone we love and everything we hold dear. Today, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons enters into force. It outlaws nuclear weapons and creates obligations to eliminate the world's nuclear arsenal. The Manhattan Project started right here at Columbia University, where the first fission experiments in the US were conducted. I am a New Yorker. My name is Michi Takeuchi. My mother survived the atomic bombing of Hiroshima.
ずっと死ぬ瞬間までほとんどのね被爆者の人たちは瞬時にして殺されていった多くの人たちの声を代弁して、その背中にそういう人たちを背負って運動してきたと思うんですね。ですからきっとそういう人たちと共に喜びを感じてくれてるんじゃないかなと。でもっと頑張りなさいということも言われているような気がしてます。
こんなのすごい条約が皆さんの手によって成立し発行できた今日、こんなに被爆者の一人として嬉しいことないですね。
これはただスタート地に立ったと私は思ってるんです。でこれから何をやるべきか、またさらに核禁止条約に賛成する国を増やさなきゃいけない。菅総理ははっきりもう背を向けてますよ、この条約に対してね。でそれに対して私はものすごい怒りを持って日本政府の態度を変えさせなきゃいけない。やっぱり自分たちが核兵器がなくても自分たちの安全を守っていくということを本当に考えてね、みんなで声を上げて政府の態度を変えさせると。
次の世代本当に核がなくなるまで続けなくてはいけないんだなという思いですね。
私たち一人一人には声を上げる権利があって、その方法の一つとして私たちは政治にアプローチすることができます。本当に最初はハードルが高いなって思うかもしれないですけど、まずは私たちのような活動のイベントに参加したりだとか、ウェブサイトとか SNS 通して見てもらえたら、いつでもこの世界でもつながれることができるので、あなたは一人じゃないし、こうやって動いている人たちと共に世界を変えていきましょう。仲間になりましょう。
私の曽祖母は被爆者ですが、私が小学生の時に亡くなってしまったため、私は直接曽祖母の言葉を聞いたことがありません。しかし今このような活動をするようになってから、もし今もひいおばあちゃんが生きていたら、私に何と声をかけるだろうかと。
想像を絶する人生、心からの願い、行動、それらの全てを知るうちに、私にできることはないかと自然と探していました。
原爆の絵は当時の写真などの資料がない場面を証言するため制作しています。このまま戦争や核兵器による被害を正しく理解していない人が 世の中の大半を占めるようになれば、未来でまた75年前と同じ出来事が起きて、罪もない人々が苦しんでしまうかもしれないと思ったからです。
日本はこの条約に署名も批准もしておりません。日本はアメリカの核の傘の下にある国であり、核兵器により私たちの国の安全が守られているという考えを持っている方も多くいるのではないかと思います。しかし、本当に核抑止によって私たちの国の安全が守られることは正しいことなのでしょうか。
私たち高校生でも行動を起こすことができました。批准国、賛成国、すべての国に私たち高校生で手紙を送りました。
核兵器の問題は被爆地だけの問題でもないし、日本全国、そして世界のすべての人が自分事として捉えるべき問題だということが改めて確認されたと思います。微力だけど無力じゃないという言葉を胸に、この核兵器禁止条約を機にスタートした核兵器廃絶への道をどんどん前に少しずつでも一緒に進んでいけたらなというふうに思っております。
Thank you, Setsuko and Louis, for bringing us these messages of hope for the future. Now, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker this evening, Erin Hunt. Erin is the program manager at Minds Action Canada. She has been working in humanitarian disarmament in various capacities since 2006. Erin has a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Victoria and a master's degree in human security and peace building from Royal Roads University. She contributes to the work of the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, the Cluster Munition Coalition, and the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. Erin was a member of the Nobel Peace Laureate International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons negotiating team during the 2017 process to negotiate the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Welcome, Erin.
Thank you so much for the very kind introduction and the invitation to join you all today. I'm speaking to you from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen people, but I recognize that most of you have logged on from land that is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, the Haudenosaunee, and allied nations to share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. In my understanding, the covenant recognizes that we all share responsibility for ensuring that this shared dish or the territory is never empty, which includes taking care of the land and the creatures we share it with. The idea that we all eat out of a dish with only one spoon is really crucial to the story that I want to share with you today. This is the story of how ordinary people used hope and courage to do the impossible, to ban the bomb and take humanity one step closer to a world without nuclear weapons. You just saw a video of an amazing moment in this story, but it's not done yet. At Minds Action Canada, we believe that ordinary people have an extraordinary impact. And as a partner organization of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN, we've seen that belief brought to life. The title of today's event, Hope for the Earth, is especially important to this story. Everyone I met in my time campaigning with ICAN was motivated by hope and by simple convictions. Nuclear weapons must be prohibited and then eliminated due to their humanitarian impact. And we all have a role to play in that process. As we remember the thousands of men, women, and children killed and injured in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, each one with a name and a story of their own, there's no question that nuclear weapons cause catastrophic humanitarian harm. Regardless of your knowledge of medicine, nuclear physics, arms control, international law, or diplomacy, it's easy to see that an indiscriminate weapon, whose impacts cannot be contained, poses an unacceptable risk to us, the land, and the creatures we share it with. If we all eat out of only one dish with only one spoon, we should never use or possess a weapon that could contaminate that dish for generations. Now back to our story. For far too many decades, this conversation about nuclear weapons was something for experts. And most of the time, those experts were men with security or military backgrounds. The opinions of the rest of us, ordinary people, were something to be humored? Maybe. But nuclear disarmament and deterrence was serious work for serious people, and that couldn't be tainted with humanity or emotion. Actually discussing what nuclear weapons would do to people was considered a weakness. Banning nuclear weapons seemed impossible. But that sentiment started to shift around 2010 through the work of ICAN and a group of like-minded states who are beginning to speak about the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. The humanitarian initiatives meetings in Oslo in 2013 and Nayarit in Vienna in 2014 really opened up the conversation about nuclear weapons. By the end of the Vienna meeting, the possibility of negotiating a treaty banning nuclear weapons was looking more and more like an achievable goal. Talking about what nuclear weapons do to people, actually bringing evidence to the table, was one of the key ways that ICAN and the international community was able to break through the diplomatic deadlock. More importantly, talking about the humanitarian impact of these abhorrent weapons allows all of us to have a say. No longer was an in-depth knowledge of warhead yields required to advocate for disarmament. The mere recognition of the global catastrophic humanitarian harm that nuclear weapons could cause is enough to justify any of us speaking out on the issue. Every person in every state has a stake in nuclear disarmament, and we were no longer willing to wait around for nuclear weapon states to disarm. At the United Nations General Assembly in 2015, states voted to hold an open-ended working group on nuclear disarmament. And in 2016, that open-ended working group recommended that the UN start negotiating a treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons. At the end of 2016, a majority of the UN General Assembly voted to start negotiations on a treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons. The negotiations started in March 2017, and on July 7th, 2017, 122 states adopted a treaty text. As you've heard from Setsuko, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons entered into force on January 22nd this year. It was a powerful and hopeful day. The TPNW, as we call it, states parties, now there are 55 of them and growing, are planning a first meeting of states parties early next year in Vienna, Austria. Okay, now I'm worried that this quick summary of how we've gotten here may have made things sound easy, but let me assure you, this was not an easy process. These milestones were built on decades of activism from ordinary people who hoped for a safer future. Having hope is important, but you have to have the courage to stand up for a better future in the face of opposition. Campaigners faced naysayers in almost every country around the world when they started talking about a new treaty banning nuclear weapons, even here in Canada. The nuclear-armed states and their allies were angry. Diplomats supporting the ban treaty were confronted and pressured to not attend humanitarian initiative meetings, to vote against the start of negotiations, and then to not attend the negotiations. Ban proponents were accused of undermining nuclear non-proliferation treaty and dividing the international community. One particularly memorable example was an informal statement by the United Kingdom that made allusions to the US and the UK causing problems for the non-proliferation treaty if states went ahead with the negotiations, and then condescendingly disregarded banned states' security concerns related to the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons as not real. Long-standing colonial power dynamics were resurrected and used to coerce states. Funding to civil society organizations like ICAN was cut, and some former champions of nuclear disarmament, like Canada, went strangely silent. One of ICAN's videos produced in the lead up to the negotiations reminded viewers that it takes courage to change the world. And the thing is, Canada knows this cliche is true, because we've done it before in the field of disarmament. When Canadian Foreign Minister Lloyd Axworthy challenged the world to come in 1996 to come back to Ottawa within a year to sign the treaty banning landmines, he was breaking diplomatic protocol and going so far out on a limb, he might as well have been standing on a leaf. That took courage, especially because almost every diplomat in the room was horrified, and they proceeded to express their unhappiness to him. On the civil society side, courage had gotten the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, or ICBL, to that point. Campaigners were told they were being unreasonable, unrealistic, and hysterical, or that they didn't understand how things really work. Faced with criticism, exasperation, and outright hostility, Axworthy in Canada, alongside the ICBL, persisted, and their courage resulted in the massive change. Now, over 20 years later, the vast majority of the planet agrees with them. Landmines have been banned, dozens of countries are completely clear of mines, and for millions of children, stepping on the playground no longer requires courage. ICAN and like-minded states were able to draw inspiration from the experience of the ICBL in Canada. Banning landmines took courage because they're a commonly used weapon, while nuclear disarmament takes courage because nuclear weapons are shrouded in myth. These myths tell us that nuclear weapons keep us safe, that they're essential for world order, and that without them, our lives are at risk. These are not facts. We have endowed nuclear weapons with abilities they don't have. All nuclear weapons can do is destroy cities and kill civilians indiscriminately by the thousands. You would never hear that weaponized anthrax keeps us safe, or that stockpiles of sarin gas are essential to world order. But we have created these myths about nuclear weapons. But let me say that again, we've created these myths. So of course, we can destroy them. But speaking out against commonly held beliefs takes a lot of courage. I have to say the examples of courage in ICAN are breathtaking. The survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki have joined with survivors of nuclear weapons testing to share their personal stories again and again in an effort to convince decision makers that nuclear weapons are unacceptable and must be prohibited and then eliminated. I don't know if I would have the courage to relive the worst day of my life over and over again, but these survivors, like Setsuko, have found it and more. They've been working for decades to prevent others from suffering as they and their families have. Alongside survivors, campaigners have worked nationally, regionally, and globally, crossing borders, generations, genders, and every other possible way to divide humanity. The ICAN delegation at the negotiations included youth, as well as the elderly survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, physicians and lawyers, teachers and students, faith leaders and academics, advocates and Indigenous leaders. In short, ordinary concerned citizens from around the world. And our diversity was indeed our strength, and it resulted in an inclusive treaty that can safely be called feminist. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or TPNW, as I've been calling it, has some of the strongest language on gender in a disarmament treaty ever. Not only does it recognize that nuclear weapons have different effects on men, women, girls, and boys, but it also promotes the participation of women in the treaty's decision-making processes and implementation. The recognition that nuclear weapons activities have had a disproportionate impact on Indigenous peoples in the treaty's preamble is groundbreaking. This is the first disarmament treaty to recognize the rights of Indigenous people, and that is due to the hard work of Indigenous activists whose land is still contaminated from nuclear weapons tests more than a half century ago. The impacts of nuclear colonialism continue to be felt, and these provisions open space for marginalized people who have been excluded from the nuclear deterrence narrative for decades. Courageous people acting collectively brought the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons from hope to reality and ensured it is an inclusive and pragmatic step forward towards the elimination of nuclear weapons. So what's next, and how can Canada and Canadians play a role? With its long history of leadership on humanitarian disarmament, some of which I've already mentioned, and 74% of Canadians being in support of the TPNW, Canada should clearly join the treaty. We belong on the right side of history. The government often cites our membership in NATO as the reason we cannot join the treaty. But the treaty does not require states to leave NATO. What is required is to reduce the importance of nuclear weapons in NATO doctrine and for states to opt out of the nuclear part of the alliance. Now, NATO only declared itself a nuclear alliance 11 years ago, and different member states have different relationships to nuclear weapons. So it isn't actually a problem to take these steps. It will take some courage though, but Canada has been called the nuclear nag before, so we can definitely do it again. It is in line with our convictions. Plus, we won't be the only voice for disarmament in NATO this time around, with Spain, Belgium, and others seeing strong public and parliamentary support for the TPNW. Even before signing and ratifying, Canada can contribute to the treaty's implementation. Canada should be participating as an observer in all treaty meetings until we join, and we should be focusing on the positive obligations provisions in the treaty. These provisions on victim assistance and environmental remediation in the treaty really mean that it can have an impact on people's lives now. It's these provisions that offer Canada and Canadians the opportunity to engage meaningfully with the treaty, even though we may not have participated in the negotiations or signed it yet. These are ways for Canada to contribute to the implementation of the treaty and pursue our foreign policy objectives. Canada says it's committed to ensuring gender equality and to pursuing reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. Engaging with the treaty, as you've heard, will help us reach those goals. Our feminist international assistance policy and Canada's work towards the Sustainable Development Goals can help support victim assistance services or environmental remediation in nuclear weapons affected communities in the South Pacific, Algeria, and Kazakhstan. But for Canada to take any of these steps, the government has to hear from Canadians. So if you're here today, please tell your member of parliament you want to see Canada sign the TPNW. And you can ask them to sign ICAN's parliamentary pledge. With a possible election looming, parliamentarians and candidates will be out looking for your vote. Tell them that you want Canada to support the TPNW. In this case, your vote gives you an extraordinary power to make change. Please use it. You can also call on your city to take a stand. Cities are the target of nuclear weapons, and it would be city first responders who have to attempt some sort of response if nuclear weapons were ever used again. So ask your local government to endorse the ICAN Cities Appeal, as Winnipeg and Pelham, Ontario have done in the past month. You can learn about both of these possible actions on the ICAN website, which I'm going to put in the chat when I'm done. Now, when I started, I said I wanted to tell you the story of ordinary people who have had an extraordinary impact. Through hope and courage, honestly, we've been more successful than we dared dream, I think. But this story is just getting started, and we really do need your help to write the next chapter. So please join us. Thank you again for having me.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Erin, for your very informative and powerful and practical message. We look forward to learning more from you and also from our next speaker, who is a member of Parliament, who's going to also give us some good advice. I'd like to next introduce you to it's actually a recorded message from MP Nathaniel Erskine Smith of the Beaches in Toronto.
Hi, I'm Nate Erskine Smith, and as the Member of Parliament for Beaches East York, I very much appreciate the invitation to say a few words as we mark the Hiroshima and Nagasaki Day of Remembrance, and I equally appreciate the advocacy and work of the Hiroshima-Nagasaki Day Coalition. 76 years ago today, far too many people lost their lives when a nuclear bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, killing 70,000 people instantly and causing the deaths of another 70,000 more before the end of that year. Just 3 days later, the bombing of Nagasaki took another 70,000 people. These were civilians, and it is unthinkable remembering these numbers years later. Nuclear war represents an existential threat, and if we've learned anything in the course of this global pandemic, I hope it's that we need to work together to address serious threats to our collective security, from pandemics to climate change, and yes, to nuclear war. It's a lesson we need to learn, and it's a lesson we need to teach those in positions of authority. There is some reason for hope, of course, because of the leadership from civil society and the leadership from other countries around the world, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons came into force on January 22nd earlier this year. It's been endorsed by over 120 countries, and per a recent Nanos poll, 74% of Canadians support or somewhat support Canada signing and ratifying the UN treaty, regardless of any pressure we may face from our American allies. 80% of Canadians think that the world should work to eliminate nuclear weapons. In 2018, Toronto City Council reconfirmed Toronto as a nuclear weapons-free zone and asked Prime Minister Trudeau to sign the treaty. More recently, in September of last year, dozens of world leaders, including former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien and former Foreign Affairs Ministers Lloyd Axworthy and Bill Graham, they wrote, "We must show courage and boldness and join the treaty," which they note provides the foundation for a more secure world. They wrote, "We must embrace it now and work to bring others on board. There is no cure for a nuclear war. Prevention is our only option." It's no coincidence, of course, that Axworthy, Graham, and Chrétien all showed great leadership in eliminating landmines via the Ottawa Treaty. And as Lloyd has said to me, many of the same arguments brought to bear today against the UN Treaty were brought to bear then against that landmine effort. Unfortunately, despite a public commitment to prevent states from acquiring nuclear weapons, decreasing the number of nuclear weapons worldwide, and eventually irreversibly eliminating them, the Canadian government has not shown the necessary leadership to meet this commitment, refusing to sign and ratify the UN treaty. In my own conversations, the government has dismissed the treaty and instead maintained that it is through the Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty that it sees a path for progress. Now, as former Senator Douglas Roche has detailed, there has been some evolution in the government's language around the treaty ban, but to put it simply, we need greater leadership to ensure all of our decisions are consistent with our goal of a world free of nuclear weapons. At a minimum, that of course means joining the treaty. More, we should work with our NATO allies to encourage a shift in long-standing deterrence thinking. If we are to see a shift in that kind of thinking, both in Canada and around the world, it will require all of us to raise our voices. Yes, to raise them loudly, but also to raise them effectively if we are to change minds. To that end, my advice is simple. Consider yourselves educators. Create a spreadsheet of every member of Parliament and make sure your organization has volunteers as much as reasonably possible within every single one of those communities. And then contact your local member of Parliament, not with a form letter, but with a personal note to explain who you are and why you care. Ask for a short meeting to explain the importance of the issue and invite your neighbors, family, friends, and colleagues to join you. The more, the better. If you can't meet with your MP, meet with their staff. In that meeting, educate us about the death toll of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, about the UN treaty, why it matters, and how Canada has failed to engage, about the threat that nuclear weapons pose today, about Canada's leadership historically on landmines, about the myths of deterrence, and why NATO membership does not preclude us from showing leadership, about the many voices calling for Canada to show that very leadership, including an overwhelming majority of Canadians. And then ask us to send a note of support to our government, to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, to the Prime Minister's office, to say that we support the UN treaty and more active efforts to fight nuclear proliferation. When you have had that meeting, follow up months later to check in. Build and maintain a positive relationship with your Member of Parliament where possible, and continue to communicate why this matters to you and to our world. This advice may seem obvious, but working to build a positive relationship with our representatives and educating them is the way to make change. And as we reflect on the events of today, 76 years ago, we need to see that change more than ever.
How encouraging. How encouraging to hear from this well-informed young MP for Beaches East York and from Aaron Hunt of Minds Action Canada with actions we can all take to urge our government's acceptance of the ban treaty. Now I would like to introduce youth animator, iconic youth leader, global influencer, environmentalist, and champion of women and children's rights, Kehkashan Basu. Kehkashan is the founder, president of global social innovation enterprise Green Hope Foundation that works at a grassroots level in 25 countries empowering young people, especially those from vulnerable communities. Empowering young people in the process of implementing the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Kehkashan is the youngest trustee of the Parliament of the World's Religions. She is council lead of the Toronto St. Paul's Constituency Youth Council, Canada, and a member of the World Humanitarian Forum Youth Council. Kehkashan has worked tirelessly to amplify the voices of young people, women, and girls in decision-making processes. She is a United Nations Human Rights Champion, winner of the 2016 International Children's Peace Prize, winner of the WUC Louis Karenbaum Impact and Innovation Award, and the first ever winner on August 5th, 2020 of the Voices Youth Gorbachev-Schultz Legacy Award for her work on nuclear disarmament. Welcome, Kehkashan.
Thank you very much, Rosemary, and hello, everyone. It has been truly inspiring to hear the myriad voices from across our country with one common message, really, that is a world free of nuclear weapons where no one is left behind. Our life hangs by a thread. If we wanted a modern day analogy, we find one in nuclear weapons, the thread of which has been ominously pendant over humanity for over 7 decades and coming perilously close to snapping on many occasions. Just one error in judgment could spell doom for millions instead of an uncontrollable chain of apocalyptic events that could bring about a nuclear winter and wipe off all vestiges of life from our planet. Now, this might sound really dramatic, but it is no fantasy. And yet the colossal short-sightedness that has prevented most of humanity from realizing this ever-present danger that we live with really befuddles me. With increasing radicalization, the rise of the ultra-right nationalism, and leaders who use inflammatory rhetoric to rally public opinion to hide their monumental inadequacies, we have a deadly mix that can very well spark a nuclear conflict fomented by fabricated security concerns that will spell doom for the planet and its denizens. There are multiple instances of these diversionary maneuvers from North Korea to the USA to India. And using that example, despite being the hardest hit by the pandemic with corpses floating in rivers, India, one of the part of the nuclear club of nations, blatantly continues to profligately invest unknown billions it can ill afford in its nuclear weaponization program, while mutely witnessing one of the largest human migrations in global history as millions of daily wage laborers, having lost their jobs, chose to walk back to their villages hundreds of kilometers away, with thousands perishing on the way, and with, as usual, no records. So is spending billions of dollars on nuclear weapons justified in any way? And the same query holds true for all other nations in the nuclear club. What moral right does the USA have to waste billions and trillions on these stockpiles when, despite touting itself as the land of opportunity, it does not even have enough ventilators for its own citizens? The US Congressional Budget Office is required by law to project the 10-year costs of nuclear forces every 2 years. And according to its latest report, the US plan is to spend an astronomical amount of $634 billion over the 2021-2030 period on its nuclear forces. Now, this defies any kind of logic, and the fact that the general populace remains blissfully unaware is what we should be working to change. For like the climate change crisis, it is this apathy, this total lack of awareness, and the general feeling that these are problems for someone else to solve that allows these issues to ferment and expand until they reach the current proportions where we may soon be powerless to control them. And at the core of the nuclear weapons industry, as my fellow panelists have stated, pervades the same social exploitation and environmental injustice that encompasses the climate crisis. There is irrefutable data now that demonstrates that the impacts of climate change and nuclear injustice disproportionately affect communities and countries who are least responsible for it. The world's worst polluters use the rest of the world as their dumping ground, consuming natural resources from the global south that destroys their environmental balance while sending them back the waste from their factories. And now climate change has perpetuated a new form of human migration, what we now call climate refuge. And the same social injustice stigmatizes the nuclear weapons industry, from the extraction of fissile ore, production, storage, waste cycling. And the only difference is that this is all still under wraps, because how many of us, even just in our country, know of how our First Nations communities were condemned to death during the production of That Man and Little Boy? And how can we forget that the men from the Satu Dene First Nations people in our Northwest territories mined and transported the radioactive ore with their bare hands without any protection, leaving behind a village full of widows? And the same injustice and exploitation of Indigenous people and their lands continues south of our border, where the system of domination meted out by the government and its corporate cronies disproportionately target and devastate the Indigenous people and their lands to maintain the nuclear production process. So from cradle to grave, the nuclear weapons production risks environmental injustices. And it's the same story of crass negligence and absolute disrespect for human life demonstrated by the US in the Marshall Islands, in the Pacific. 67 weapons were detonated on the Enewetak Atoll and Bikini Atoll between 1946 and 1958. And despite resettlement efforts, the radiation levels in parts of that country are still almost double what has been deemed safe for human habitation. India's uranium mine, Jadagoda, home to its indigenous tribal population known as the Adivasis, is now termed as a nuclear graveyard. Millions there continue to be exposed to radioactive waste for several decades now, hapless citizens who are paying the price of India's ambitions of becoming a permanent member of the UN Security Council. Now, what security that calls for, we don't know. And what happens with North Korea is anybody's guess. Now, as a young person, I do not accept this injustice. We can never succeed and move ahead if we're constantly looking back over our shoulder to see what's coming to hit us. And that is one of the things that needs to change with the way we address two of our world's most dangerous problems. First, that of nuclear weapons, and second, that of climate change, both of which can literally wipe out humanity and our entire planet. We are funding our own doom, and most of us remain blissfully unaware or are too complacent to care and just leaving it to someone else to solve. And that is what Green Hope Foundation's mission is, to increase awareness among civil society's largest, most vibrant, yet woefully excluded stakeholder, us young people, especially in the global south, using education for sustainable development as a transformative tool to engage children, some as young as 4, turning them into agents who bring about change through action. But we focus specifically, as Rosemary mentioned earlier, on children and youth from marginalized communities most affected by climate change and social inequities, but at the same time are oblivious to the injustices that are wrought upon them. The very simple act of redirecting the money for building one nuclear weapon towards helping solve their issues will go a long way in ensuring climate justice, because that is what we work towards, nuclear and climate justice. So how do we ensure climate and nuclear justice? This week, Green Hope Foundation launched our DREAM project, a mobile library which runs on solar energy. The children of this village in Bangladesh, like hundreds of villages in the global south, have missed out on going to school for 1.5 years, and let alone a library. So we decided to bring the library to their doorstep to ensure that they're able to have the education that allows them to create peaceful societies. Earlier this month, we distributed solar cookers to the women of a small village in Western India. These women are daily wage earners who leave the house early in the morning and come back by 4 p.m. to then cook lunch for their hungry children. Now they can put the ingredients in their solar cookers in the morning when they go out for work, and the food will be ready when they return home. This is our way of creating peace in lives of people, especially women and girls, using clean energy, which is also essential for good health and is climate smart. Our project Powering Education in Rural Liberia is installing solar panel grid, so solar panels on homes, schools, and the community center, as well as solar streetlights in a town that was so far without electricity. It's a climate smart and gender smart way of ensuring that electricity reaches the town because we're providing safe spaces to the girls to allow them to go to school, providing them with computer literacy and enabling them to move away from a life of drugs and crime. And their upliftment is lifting their entire town out of poverty and thus creating a new generation of leaders who will take informed decisions on the fate of our planet. Gender equality is an integral part of our work at Green Hope Foundation, where we focus on empowering women and girls in vulnerable, marginalized communities most affected by climate change-induced disasters, working with them on clean water and sanitation, skills building through education, sustainable fishing, and teaching them how to protect themselves and their children from sexual assault. Therefore, when we speak about morality, about the link between climate and nuclear weapons, we have to speak about this climate justice. And that includes, again, redirecting the resources towards those affected most by environmental and social injustice. Can you believe that even in this day and age, people do not have access to clean drinking water, but nations still have enough money to waste on creating weapons of mass destruction? During this pandemic, we've installed deep bore tube wells in the villages of Bangladesh, where prior to this installation, the children and the elderly and the women used to die from mysterious diseases from drinking contaminated arsenic water. And now they don't have to do that anymore. We've built toilets to ensure proper hygiene and sanitation, particularly of women and girls, and installed rainwater harvesting systems in a way that is most effective for the village, and all to create peaceful and sustainable societies. And if we as a civil society, youth-led organization with our limited funds can do this, don't nations have a moral responsibility to allocate their funds to help their citizens? So Green Hope Foundation works on peace, disarmament, and climate justice education so people are aware of how the destruction caused by climate change and nuclear weapons threatens global peace. And once they're aware, they can take action. We do this getting our voices heard at the highest levels of policymaking at the United Nations to working at the grassroots, where our work has evolved to our digital academies. And we've created digital toolkits on disarmament, compiling children and youth voices from across the world. We have composed peace songs, and our most impactful campaign now has the tagline, "We want books, not nukes." This is Green Hope Foundation's call to action. Through education, we want to empower children and young people and bring them to the forefront of the change-making dialogue, because at the end of the day, it is all of our futures that is at stake. Whether we are dealing with anthropogenic climate change or nuclear weapons, both pose the risk of annihilating our planet. And it is extremely important that now we take action. Both are inexorably pushing us to the brink of extinction. They are the biggest threats to human rights and equitable well-being. And at this time, when we as a world, we're coming out of the pandemic pause, it is high time that we recognize the importance of multilateralism, of collaboration. And there does seem to be greater consensus now more than ever before, not to build back better, but to build forward better into a new normal that really ensures that we are working together to obliterate these two greatest obstacles in our path to creating a world where no one is left behind. To conclude, I shall read out the action pledge for nuclear disarmament, something which we all can undertake. First, get involved. Join the HNDC or other like-minded organizations working to end nuclear weapons. Encourage friends and family to do likewise. Second, learn more. See the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN. See the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Thirdly, involve our elected officials, encourage municipalities to do as Toronto did, and ask that Canada support the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Fourth, write to our parliamentarians, write to Prime Minister Trudeau and Foreign Affairs Minister Marc Garneau, urging Canada's support for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And finally, no investment in nuclear weapons. Find out if your financial institutions are supporting the nuclear weapons industry and saying no to them. All of the links will also be shared via email so that you would be able to access them easily. And with that, thank you very much. And together, let us commit on this Hiroshima Nagasaki Day, 76 years later, to do everything in our power to eliminate nuclear weapons once and for all. Thank you.
Kehkashan, thank you so much for your impassioned, informative, and empowering presentation, and for reminding us two things: that we are part of a global community where all of us are impacted by these large issues, where the millions and billions spent on nuclear weapons is wasted on weapons that can never be used, and that these monies should be allocated to human needs. And thank you for reminding us that youth have the strength and the passion and the capacity to lead us into the future. Thank you so much. Finally, now we would like to present a short slideshow highlighting some of the celebrations around the world upon the entry into force in January of this year of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. As we view the slideshow, accompanied by the music of Ron Korb, let us consider how we can take action and work together as Canadians and members of our global community to build a world free of nuclear weapons. I will make some closing remarks following the slideshow. Thank you. I would like to express our deep appreciation to all of this evening's presenters for your clear, strong, inspirational messages from near and far, and for your unwavering commitment to the abolition of nuclear weapons. You have shown us what we can do. You have given us the tools to take action. To all participants, thank you for joining us. Please enjoy the last few moments of our webinar this evening by listening to Ron Korb's music once more as we reflect on the lantern ceremony in commemoration of those whose lives were lost.
I'm ready to jump in if we need to.
Would you mind reversing the order possibly? And then I'll have this video ready. It's just downloading. I had it downloaded, but it's, would you mind reversing the order? Thanks.
Please go ahead, Ron.
Okay.
Yes.
Need more time? Oh, there we go.
Thank you, everyone, and good night.